Welcome to Learning cEDH, the podcast dedicated to teaching you everything you need to know about competitive Commander. I'm your host, Matthew, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Eric. And this week, we're bringing you the quarterly report for the last quarter of 2024, the post-ban meta, the end of cEDH, whatever you want to call it. We are taking a look at a data set that I think is purely post-ban because the bans happened in September. So October through December is all no Dockside, no JLo, no Mana Crypt, none of that. Just pure good old-fashioned Magic the Gathering with no mana acceleration.
You know, just the way Richard Garfield intended. Oh, wait, he made Moxes and Black Lotuses and those types of cards.
I think Mana Vault, Dark Ritual, all that stuff in Alpha. But no Volcanic Island in Alpha. He knew what he was doing with that. But yeah, we're taking a look at the top 10 decks. If you're joining us for the first time for one of these, we take a look at using the data from EDH Top 16. We're going to be looking at tournaments that had more than 60 entrants. And we're going to be taking a look at the top 10 decks based on popularity, going from 10 to 1, going over their conversion rate, how many entries they had, how many top 16s they got, which when you hear conversion rate, that's what we're talking about. The entries versus the top 16s, the percentage of people who converted from being in the Swiss to being into top 16, and breaking down why we think things moved up, why they moved down. This is post-ban, so a lot of things changed. But honestly, the top 10 decks isn't the wildest change. We do have a couple that have moved up a lot, and we do have some interesting statistics to bring out about a couple of them, but it's not the craziest looking top 10 list that we've ever had.
I was pretty shocked when we were going through this because, we've been very much told that the format's extremely open, so going back and seeing, a lot of the, finally as the decks settled down and people kind of realized that they could still do some powerful things with like strategies that got affected specifically with the Dockside ban. So just seeing how decks have adapted, especially to like, as we're going to go over things like Sisay and Blue Farm, etc.
Yeah, I think what for the most part we've seen is that high color piles that were using Dockside, predominantly just found other things that they could do to sort of replace that, and they haven't lost that much meta share. Losing Dockside was a thing that impacted most decks, and a lot of those decks with things like we're not going to get to talk about, like Kenrith, that didn't quite make the top 10, which was like a solid number 5 popularity-wise, previously, just found other things they could do. Sisay probably being the best example of a dedicated Dockside deck, or seemingly one before the bans, and post-ban just has other things they can do. They get to do the Asika thing to make all their creatures mana dorks. You're seeing more of them run Gigantha, mainly in the 99, not as a companion, running more ways to take advantage of untapping their dorks, having haste enablers, things like that. A lot of the decks have bounced back. Some of the really dedicated decks, like we've talked about, Corvold is like number 11, I think, on the last time we did one of these, or number 12, like it was up there. I know we did honorable mentions for it and Rock Thras. They're right next to each other in terms of popularity. You're not going to see Corvold getting its way towards the top 10 in popularity, I'm assuming, anytime soon. We'll see.
No.
Eric's undefeated with him post-ban, so, maybe people will catch on, but it's...
undefeated in local events.
Hey, those are
undefeated in local events.
You haven't gone to anything else, right? So...
that's it.
That's still undefeated. Yeah, we're going to be breaking it down. I think first we're going to go over some honorable mentions, some decks that maybe didn't quite make the cut or had some numbers that we wanted to kind of point out to. Then we're going to go up from 10 to 1, going over all the stats that I mentioned. And then last, we're going to sort the decks again, but this time looking at them by conversion rate, so you can kind of see what decks were actually percentage-wise performing the best. Because looking just at popularity, it is really relevant for understanding what the metagame looks like, because the decks that are most popular are what you're playing against. You need to know about that, but it isn't really the best showcase of what is the top performer. So we're going to get to look at that as well. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want, really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. Use the link in the description below. Give Whatnot a try. Any honorable mentions you kind of want to bring up? Decks that overperformed, underperformed, that didn't quite make the top 10, had some pretty shocking numbers.
The deck that really stuck out to me in terms of, and I'm picking this deck just because it was pretty new. That's probably Glarb, the Calamity Augur. That's the Sultai Frog. In popularity, it's not.
The frog.
It's like 21 in popularity, but in conversion, and we'll go over that. based on the metrics that we're going to be utilizing, it has like a 32% conversion rate, I believe, with 8 top cuts. So
Mhm.
Glarb actually doing pretty good, especially for being a brand new commander right out of Bloomborough. So
What we should generally expect is decks that have an Esper core or something close to it, like Demir or Azorius, are probably going to perform well, especially as newer lists, because they're the core of just stapley things that you get to put in your deck are so strong. Glarb is probably less synergistically built. It definitely is. Like, it is a Doomsday. You're running 4 drops and such. Are things that Glarb gets to cast off the top. Something like Plagon is a deck that numbers wise in popularity isn't anywhere near here, but it's a deck people have been talking about and has had some good performances. That is like very synergy based. You're running every like all these little dinky 1/2s and 0/2s and 2/4s or whatever to kind of get it going, and then tons of like flicker effects to get it going. And drawing lots of cards and being in base blue black or blue white, I think is a pretty solid place to be. And then Sultai in general as a color combination, and green decks especially, just lost less because their mana production was hurt way less, I think, than a lot of the red based decks, where was a lot of decks were doing to generate mana. Sultai for a long time didn't have a deck that really represented it at all. You're really talking like before this podcast, before my channel, when you're going over decks like Tevish Thras wasn't much of a thing. It started to become one now. And then you're looking at Tassiger was definitely before the time I was a channel. I mean, that was like at the time that was definitely some like cEDH database cope of like it's actually not winning anything, it's not doing well, it's bad, but there's people who still mention it and whatever. It's blue black. It could only be so bad, I guess. But now we are seeing Sultai really start to like kind of come back, and some cool synergistic commanders like Glarb can really help.
yeah, with Sultai specifically, you mentioned about like the Esper shells. I think it's either like you have like a Demir, it's like Demir plus or Simic plus.
Mm.
And depending on which way you go, because ultimately each color combination there provides like, if you go with the black, you get access to the tutors. And then if you decide to go with the green, you get, like you said, the dorks and those types of things. And then just depending on what that other like third or fourth color might be determines if you get the smothering tithe, enlightened tutor, those things. But ultimately they all have one thing in common, and that's the 80 blue staples that are in the deck. But
Yes.
I joke a little bit, but ultimately they are going to run the best blue cards. Magic cEDH really reminds me a lot of earlier Yu-Gi-Oh when there was just staples and then you had a sprinkling of whatever strategy you're running.
Mm.
For the longest time, Yu-Gi-Oh was very much dominated by the premature burials, monster reborns, Raigekis, Call of the Haunted, Jinzos. You didn't have a lot of room for like a lot of strategies until they started printing more synergistic sets. cEDH reminds me a lot of that, especially like right now, just because if you're playing blue, you're automatically going to slot in, your Force of Wills, your Mystic Heuristics,
Mm.
and potentially, and there's very little room for that adjustment. So based on if you'd like to go 3+ color, when you get down to the 2 color stuff, like you mentioned, the blue white starfish, you get a little bit more room to play with the deck and actually lean into the deck's natural synergies.
Yeah.
So you not only get to run the staples of your colors, but then you get to actually take advantage of those cards and like what that specific commander might be doing.
Yeah, you're definitely going to see decks that if you're able to lean into some sort of advantage engine, you are a little bit more likely to be able to push into synergy stuff, like Plagon being an example, and Glarb too, both being sources of card advantage. Finding the balance of them over time is going to be like a lot of the streamlining of that deck. That's going to be like where the optimization happens. But having that core of like my thing gets me extra cards is good, and then having especially the fallback of, well, I can tutor for turn 2 Ristic or whatever, turn 2 Wondering, having that to fall back on is huge. That is a major part, especially of decks that get access to tutors. Not so much in Azorius, you have Enlightened Tutor or whatever, but especially black decks that can just default to Vamp Tutor to unmulligan me. It's pretty powerful crutch to get to lean on right now.
The reason why I like brought up Glarb is that card seems super unassuming. It's a card that's just basically, bug colors. There's no colorless attached to it or anything like that. And it's a frog, and its just ability allows you just to, I don't know. The Surveil 2 is pretty powerful every turn. That's something that I actually really like. And I do like the fact that you're getting to play cards that don't get to see as much play currently in the environment of cEDH or in a while. Like Doomsday's strictly pretty much been like the Esper deck with like Tymna Malcolm. That's pretty
Mhm.
much been the Doomsday deck. I've seen Hermit Druid builds of Glarb. with the Memory's Journey, which is really nice. I've seen
Mhm.
obviously the Doomsday builds. Most of them are on Bowls of Citadel too because they take advantage of that. So and they're getting to run Sensei's Dividing Top. So it's, they're probably running, I'd say, 10 synergistic slots that happen to also just be decent plus cards on their own.
Some decks I want to mention, not kind of on the opposite end, that were decks that people expected to maybe do well. One of them, I think people expected them to do well were just wrong, and it was just a bad expectation. And the other, I think, is just kind of a more interesting look into what the metagame looks like, and that is Tymna, which is pretty popular. It's sitting at like 13th on popularity, but with a abysmal, frankly, 8% conversion rate. Some people thought stacksy things or the Tymna mid-range engine. I do think Tymna isn't strictly a stacks deck, but runs a lot of stacks pieces to support its mid-range engine in developing. That has lined up very poorly into a Seedborn Thrasios metagame where other decks actually have your plan and they have way better tools to deal with you than you have to deal with them. If you get into games where there's like a Seedborn, Psych Rift, Born Upon a Wind kind of gameplay happening, Tymna does not benefit from that really because that's kind of their game plan, but they're doing it without blue. They're doing it where they're having to set up a commander. They've lost the ability to generate some mana. They weren't like the most dedicated Jeweled Lotus Mana Crypt deck, but they are a deck that has to set up to get the thing going, and that's when they're powerful. They're not strong. They're not threatening to dominate the table in the early turns. They have to get that engine going. They have to get permanents on board. They got to get counters on board. And while the time they're doing that, a lot of the blue decks are developing just as well and have really good answers and are playing a similar game plan. And I think Tymna has lined up pretty poorly there. And then Derevi is a deck that people, I think, seem to expect to do pretty well with red, kind of leaving the format basically. And there's just more room for the Simic base like you were talking about. Derevi is a really powerful One Ring deck. One Ring is definitely a card that's gotten better post-ban in my assessment. Derevi is having to deal with the why not Tymna X problem, I think, at the moment. Why not Tymna Thrasios, where you get access to black and a ton of consistency, and is, again, kind of a synergistic deck with triple pips in the zone, where the payoff isn't win the game, it's a lot of advantage. And I think it being scarier than a lot of those other decks. You mentioned Glarb kind of flying under the radar. Derevi really doesn't. If Derevi comes down, there's a One Ring in play. People are doing everything they can to get rid of it. The color combination, I think, not being the most consistent. A lot of the most powerful stuff Derevi can do is kind of between artifacts and creatures, so you're kind of pushed in two different directions. That is a deck that I think people expected to do pretty well and hasn't really lined up that great, and also lost its probably actual most powerful card in Nadu.
That deck was pretty sweet with Nadu. And again, we've talked about it before. Nadu in the main deck was actually really cool.
Oh, it was so builds. Good. If they bring back Bandit's Commander, bring Nadu back. I'm so down.
One other deck I just want to mention is Malcolm Vile with 30 entries and 30% conversion rate and 9 top cuts, maybe like 16th or 17th, I think, in popularity. But it has this really good showing for the amount of entries per the number of cuts. So really low to enter, but still doing very well.
It helps that Lily just top 16s every event she goes to where she plays it all the time. So yeah, shout out to Lily doing the Malcolm Vile thing. But yeah, that is another deck that I mentioned as probably one to watch out for post-ban. It still has the strong Grixis core where like Nas Necro are still really busted things to do if you can do them. But it has that hey, I can just sit on a Malcolm. I can be kind of unassuming for a little bit. I could do Born Upon a Wind stuff. I can do like all these different plans that it has, like where it gets to go a little bit bigger than like some of the other similar decks that are like similar pace decks or like other Grixis core things. So that's definitely a deck I still think is probably underplayed. And the numbers, at least for right now, seem pretty good and kind of support that.
Oh yeah, like I would never scoff at like 30% conversion rate on 30 entries. That's pretty awesome.
All right, I think with that, we can take a look at the actual decks that actually made it into our top 10.
Real quick, before we get started, I do want to say these are not our opinions. These are just based on the metrics off of the website, cEDH Top 16. So if you haven't listened to the beginning of the video where Matt breaks down our criteria, go back, listen to how he breaks it down. Then that way you can follow along and you're not in the comments going, well, I don't agree with you. Well, that's great. I don't agree with some of these either, but here we are.
And again,
we have to do this for every video, but
it's fine. And every video is going to be someone's first video too. Like, so
for sure.
I don't blame you skipping the intro, going straight to the decks. You want to hear about a Rog Thras and how cool it is. We're going to give opinions on the data that we always looked at. This is what we've done for over a year now. We always look at 60 plus events, stuff like that. We're not changing anything, but we're going to break down the top 10, but then give you our opinions on why we think they're there. But other than that, it's not our top 10. My top 10, you think Kinnan's going to be up there? Heck no, dude. The guy's a chump. But at number 10, and again, we're sorting by popularity, not by conversion rate for popular decks. We'll get to that at the end. We are looking at Rograk and Thrasios with 59 entries, 11 top 16s for an 18.64% conversion rate. So a kind of medium conversion rate. We're going to be looking kind of from 13-ish up to 24. 25. Oh, and actually 26. So it's kind of in the middle for conversion rates we're going to be looking at. It's not at the highest end. I could have done better. I could have brought these numbers up. If I had top 16 the boil, they'd be a little higher. I did my best. I top 16 all the rest of them. Thras is a deck that was at points during the post-ban meta was like in the top 3. Was doing really, really well. I think as it's getting more popular, it is I think a pretty hard deck to play. So I think it will, I expect to have a lower than average conversion rate, especially as it gets more popular and it's less just Sam Black playing it and top 16ing every single event he enters. More Thras pilots that are doing really well and are doing more like getting more top 16s and attending more events regularly. It's a really interesting time to look at Thras because post-ban, every deck has changed a lot. But Thras went from kind of a normal build of itself, losing Dockside and kind of just changing up a little bit to do different Cloudstone stuff. But now has started to become this really otter-focused Bloomburrow deck that is doing, we've seen like Song of Totentans builds. I think we're seeing less of that now. Stuff with Dowerport Mage and really trying to break Valley Flood Caller in combination with things like Cryptolith Rite and Enduring Vitality, other enablers for turning all of your creatures into mana dorks. So it's a deck that's changing a lot, and I think probably is taking a hit right now as people try to solve this new really powerful synergy focus build. But I think we'll end up catching up when people figure out what the right balance is. Like we were at the start of this cycle playing a lot of Breach, Intuition, Shifting, Woodland focused stuff, and now we're moving away from that. So the deck has changed a lot, but it's in a really exciting place. And I think the main point to take away from it is it is still a really big mana deck, and it no longer has the Dockside focus. So we're able to like lean as much into red or not, leaving red as much as we want. And also, when everyone else lost Dockside, Crypt, and Jeweled Lotus, they lost way more than we did in terms of mana production, because that was never the best way to make mana in this deck. It's always been Cradle, Relic of Legends, all that broken stuff. And now Enduring Vitality plus Kinnan, Valley Flood Caller, and untapping your rats and your frogs and stuff like that. It is the big mana deck of the format, and it's I think it lost a lot less than people expected of a Dockside Cloudstone deck, because we're really not that deck anymore.
What I'm excited about is our future sets that are going to get printed in Magic. And every time there is rats, frogs, those types of things that get printed, otters, you get to go, is this a Thras card?
Yep.
So that's going to be a fun one, because the joke is, for people who don't know, there was always like a warrior would come out and then it would be like, is this a Najeela card? And then trust me, I don't know, every time a derpy treasure card would come out, they'd be like, is this going Corval? And I'm like, no. But
Painful.
That's going to be really interesting. What I was going to note about Thras, I think you said it, basically where it's basically had a pretty drastic change, like even post-ban till now. Like if you're following the journey of Sam Black. So when you do that and you see how it's been iterated so many different times, whether it's Sam, yourself, or other pilots, there's not a sold 100 or 99 or 98 technically.
Oh yeah.
That's everybody just kind of like, okay, this is like 2 to 3 cards difference, for people. Everyone has a different interpretation on it, because whether you think that red is more needed or less needed. So that's where the deck kind of is always in flux. And decks like that, I think, are always the most interesting, just because you can tell the best build, and there really isn't inherently a best build, but the builds that maybe perform the best over a long term. And this is the most exciting part to me, is where we're recording right now, and then where if we where we end up next to the end of next year, minus bans and all that other stuff. We did this before, where we watched the metagame shift, and we're like, okay, we can't really draw a ton of conclusions right now, because this is kind of the first start of the wave of, it's like I would say preseason for NFL, but we're 4 games in. Over the next 3 months, when we come back and revisit this, that's where we're going to start seeing the trends in the data, minus any kind of printing of a new busted commander.
That'll be where we really solidify, where we went from just kind of our projections and what we expect to happen to, this is what we're starting to see. But then it'll, definitely, I think by the next update be, okay, here's where we really are with a lot of actual games happening. This is where we're at. And then again, I know we're getting less product next year. That's actually a confirmed thing. They're printing less cards next year. There will be less sets. But, is Spider-Man going to break Rock Threat? I don't know. Vulture, he might be a bird. So, like, it could be really good to untap him with Valley Flood Caller. We don't know yet. We aren't sure.
So,
but yeah, it is really exciting how much this deck has changed. And we have some things that have in this time period cemented themselves as more staples. Like the Rock Threats Discord kind of looks at cards and has a data set we look at for like all the deck lists that are submitted and shows you percentage like include for recent deck lists. So there's like Candelabra of Thanos is at like 100%. So like that's become like a set staple in the deck. But then there are other things like Song of Creation that more storm oriented builds run. Some of the Otter builds lean into the non-creature part of what they do. They're like more all in on the Kitsa, dramatic reversal, stuff like that. Whereas some are just like really heavy creature, Cryptolith Rites, everything that resembles that, Growing Rites of Itlamok, trying to get every sort of cradle type effect you can. So there is like a lot of different stuff. And it's cool that some different ones have done well. Like in this time period, I played like a Breach, pretty bare bones normal list that did well. And then Sam has played pure Otter nonsense and done well with it just in this 3 months. So sometimes you'll see decks have a lot of build variety, but it's really like decks the top 16 all look the same. But here so far with Rock Thras right now, there's been a lot of stuff and there's a lot more I think to look forward to.
Number 9, we got Najeela the Blade Blossom at 60 entries, 8 top cuts at a 13.33% conversion rate. Oh, how the mighty have fallen.
And for some context, Najeela has been on a steady decline really for the last year, maybe even a little bit longer. I think it's been on a steady decline. It's dipped up and down. But I remember last time we looked at it, it was like fairly low on the bottom half, whereas like there was a time when we looked at this deck and we expected it to be top 3, kind of guaranteed. And now we're looking at a deck that could just not be on the top 10 next update, and it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, it's just with the way the format is shaping up. We talked about this off camera. The way the format's shaping up, it just seems like it's not very favorable for what Najeela is doing. Now, don't get me wrong. Najeela is still just a pile of 5-color good cards, but they've gotten to where even the ad nauseum builds, like we'll take the most recent decent one, but they're on like Champion of Lambholt, Gornog, the Red Reaper. You already added like things like Cutzel and obviously Samu made its way into the deck. They're still in Grim Hireling, Derevi, and then Chatterfang. But if you go over to the instant section, they're still on Ad Nauseam. I just don't know if that's where I'd want to be on that deck. Like, I don't know like how good Ad Nauseam really is in that list. I'm not really sure. Now, Ad Nauseam is still just a very powerful card. And then you still get to rely on the shell of the green mana acceleration that you have, along with like Tinderwall and Elvish Spirit Guide. Those are still quite good in that deck. But it's just interesting when I look at a deck like this and it's very creature focused. And then I see the Ad Nauseam, but I see Angel's Grace. I also see Brain Freeze. And then if I'm on Brain Freeze, I'm clearly on the LED. So I feel like it has a lot of moving parts to it. I would either like to see a little less focused on the creatures and maybe a little bit cleaner Ad Nauseam, or I'd like to see the opposite. No Ad Nauseam, maybe follow through, play something like the One Ring or something like that. So
the tension of building for Najeela and building for a 5-color Nas deck has been just a thing that we've talked about like the whole time we've been doing this. And I think in general, high color Nas piles aren't really at their best right now, losing Mana Crypt and Dockside especially. Najeela and other 5-color decks, but especially Najeela, have been at war with their mana base for years at this point. And Dockside was just that easy. I need one red pip and my mana problems are over, especially post Nas. We've talked about it's just like, just find that Rite of Flame, find that Spirit Guide, and then get that Dockside down. And so not being able to rely on that to help fix your post Nas issues means that a deck that already wasn't the best main phase Nas deck is like significantly worse at it, I think, and is now a end-step Nas deck more than likely in a lot of scenarios. And sometimes you just have the Dark Rit Cabal Rit pop off like turns. Like sometimes that is going to happen, but it feels like now the strengths of Najeela, it doesn't seem like it's worth doing the Nas plan at the moment when like this, nothing like Najeela does really synergizes with it. And the way you have to develop, it's harder to just like be able to develop Najeela and be able to pop out a Nas, because again, Dockside into Nas was another way to do that, where I could prioritize red mana early with Najeela, get some lit, get kind of going, drop a Dockside, it's a Nas. I kind of feel like the other part of it too is if you have just sort of a halfway Najeela plan, in, you're not getting in. You're not getting in with warriors through these Thrasios boards. If you're committing to like Gornog, Orin, Frostfang, whatever you're doing to like really push Najeela as a attacking deck, you can get through and do the Najeela thing. If you're just kind of spitting out 1/1s, they're just going to eat the, Delighted Halflings and the Tymnas and all that stuff are just going to block the crap out of them. And you're not really going to be able to do the Najeela pressure. And the inevitability plan, as the game has gotten slower, people are just sitting there waiting for you to try to push and to do a thing. Like the Najeela inevitability is much less of a thing when we're basically in a flash meta where people can just wait for you to put that Najeela activation on the stack with no blockers and they just win on top of you. So I think a lot of that is just weakened. And I think if you want to do 5-color Nas, honestly, you probably should look at like Asika or something that gives you some mana acceleration. Asika is kind of nice too, because the cool thing about 5-color Nas decks and just green-based Nas decks is developing your dorks into a Nas, and Asika is a green card as well that gets you dorks and is a dork and can turn your other creatures into dorks like Lothos, things like that.
So you mentioned that, and I want to just pause you right there just because I think it's really, really important. And I'm not going to go through every single list, but I'm just going through the previous list that did really well. They're not on Cabal Ritual. They're also not on Culling the Weak. When I don't see Culling the Weak in a green-based ad nauseum deck, I really cause to pause because Culling the Weak's really powerful. Like that card is very, very good. You'll even see Blue Farm still play it just because it is the card that's going to allow you to have a lot of that post ad nauseum or into the ad nauseum. It allows you just to get that extra mana because typically also you need a way to sometimes potentially get rid of like your Esper Sentinel.
Yeah, your Kraum.
Or your Kraum and Blue Farm, Esper Sentinel and Najeela too, just to remove it if you're going for a Thassa's Oracle combo, those types of things. I'm pretty shocked to not see, I understand Cabal Ritual because I don't think Cabal Ritual is inherently like very good in this deck, but Culling the Weak, yes, I that's a card that I typically want to see, and I just see a lot of extra interaction, but I don't really see like certain things that like aid your attacking plan, specifically like the green enchantment that allows you to, what is it? It's
Like
green
Druid's
one whenever
Repository?
you attack. Yes. That's a card I'd like to see in these creature builds. This player clearly did very well, so I'm sure they extensively tested and drew different conclusions. It's just that when I see a deck that when the commander doesn't inherently synergize with your plan, or even the pieces of the deck, like you just have like LED, Brain Freeze, and ad nauseum, it just kind of like, I mean, I get like those can do the thing with your breach, but when your strategy itself doesn't even lean into that way, I don't know. I just think that that's where you got a lot of tension there and you're really struggling with your identity within the deck.
At number 8, we have with 68 entries, 18 top 16s for a 26.47% conversion rate, the highest we're going to be looking at today. That is Tivit, Seller of Secrets. Tivit is a really interesting case where it seemed like that deck would not do super favorably post-ban. There were like a couple things that took away from it and added to it, right? Tivit's, if you resolve him or even the way you usually accelerate him, he feeds Dockside like crazy. Tivit just inherently, the Dockside count in the game is way higher in a Tivit pod. That's just typically how it goes. They lost Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt, two of the better cards at helping accelerate both Tivit itself and some of their engines in the case of, Turn 1, Bristics, early Smothering Tides, etc. with Mana Crypt. But the thing that they've really benefited from is the game is slower. There is a reason to have Tivit in the command zone because we're not in a Rog size centric meta. Your biggest worry is no longer surviving to turn 2 or 3. You are now expecting the game to go to time, honestly. Get into the turn 4 and 5 where most players will get to develop. That should be your expectation. You might want to still play responsibly, and a lot of Tivit players will do that. But Tivit getting to that long game, I think, is the thing that has buffed it, even though looking at the deck list, the Tivit deck list looks significantly weaker than it was before. You still have that Esper Core we talked about. You have that way to save your mulligans with the Vamp Tutors and the Lighten Tutors and the Imp Seals and all this stuff. You have that Esper Core. You aren't nearly as scary as the decks that are similar to you, like Blue Farm, but are in red, that have, less ability to be explosive, but still have that ability to just turn Breach into a win. So you have like less of a boogeyman status. Your commander looks ludicrous to cast. So I think like there's some of that happening where you are the good guy most of the time as Tivit in the early turns. And then if the game gets to the point where you're getting to resolve Tivit, he's kind of sitting on the board forever. That Ward 3 is still tough to deal with, and you do have a 1-card combo with your commander.
One thing I like about not even one thing I like about Tivit specifically. So, like you mentioned this when it was a Dockside, Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, all those cards were legal. Tivit started off really hot. It gained a lot of popularity, and then it went through this weird evolution through our time of actually diving into the data, not
Mhm.
just headcanon things. Looking at it, Tivit started to decline. It was still up there. There's no shame in being a top 12 deck at all. It's really hard for for most decks to be there,
Mhm.
but we started to see a decline in Tivit because they started jamming all these like very stacksy like cards in there. Like, oh, I gotta fit Karn in this list. I gotta, those types of
Like,
cards.
they
And
had to run blind obedience space, like, they're kinda priced in to
yeah,
stuff like that. Dauntless Dismantler.
yeah, so there was this push and pull because Tivit doesn't want to inherently slam its Tivit early because that's just kind of one of those things that it wants to set back. It wants to kind of be that control mid-range deck, but it had the ability to, and it was really hard to kill a Tivit, especially
Mhm.
then too when there were also less cards seeing play that could actually counter Tivit. And now we talked about how the format's slower. Well, it favors Tivit because while Tivit doesn't have like the green for mana acceleration. What it does have, it dedicated like this particular list I'm looking at from the vault. They're on all three talismans. They're on Felwar Stone, along with Arcane Signet, and then their traditional mana acceleration that we see: the Soul Rings, the Mox Opals, those types of cards. Grim Monolith. We see City of Traders over in the mana over here. So we see the ability to, still like not turbo but ramp out Tivit. We also see
Mhm.
Smothering Tithe as a great card in this current metagame. But one thing that Tivit gets to do that you don't get to see a lot, and that's the Cavern of Souls being in a 3-color deck. Just the ability to guarantee to resolve your Tivit, is really, really nice. So that's something that this deck can do. This deck takes advantage of that. And it's one of the very few Urza Saga decks in the format. So
Mhm.
again, it can go get that Soul Ring, which if you think about it, if it's going for the Soul Ring to cast the Tivit that turn, it gets the mana off the Urza Saga.
Yep.
Then you get to tutor up the soaring. So yeah, it's basically a +3. You just need 3 pips, cast your Tivit, you're ready to rock and roll. They were typically always on that, but you get to really see Urza Saga shine because the deck gets the chance to actually get those turns. It's just not like, oh, Dockside resolves, somebody has a
Mhm.
combo, we're dead.
Yeah, you would definitely have games
So
where Saga, all it did was increase the dockside count. But yeah, it plays, I think, pretty well into what's happening right now. It's a great Smothering Tithe deck. You have an amazing place to put the mana. Once you have Tivit, he gives you another place to put the mana. I played the other day actually and got to do a turn 2 Tivit plus Notion Thief on turn 2, which was pretty sick. Pretty good. He can really do the thing. You start smacking people for 6, it adds up. Tivit is, I think, a deck that we could maybe see people stop kind of being politicked by. There is a lot of heavy politics in the meta right now, and maybe you will see people sort of start to prioritize the decks that do well into a long game, your TNTs and your Tivits and stuff like that, and kind of try to stifle their development. Or these could just be really consistent performers that just get through all of that stuff that's trying to set them back anyways. It'll be interesting to see. But Tivit is arguably one of the best performers in this first post-ban breakdown.
yeah, and one last thing about Tivit, it's the deck that gets to play both Grafdigger's Cage and Curse Totem.
Yes.
So it gets to attack the two types of like archetypes that are out there, whether it's Underworld Breach or green
Mhm.
based decks with activated abilities. So that's really nice. All right, next on our list, it's Yuriko the Tiger Shadow with 70 entries, 9 top cuts, and a 12.85% conversion rate.
Yeah, so not very good conversion rate there. This is a deck that people got really excited about when the bans got announced. I don't really know why. I guess Yuriko was positioned interestingly to be a synergy focused deck that doesn't run Jewel Lotus and that doesn't play Dockside Extortionist and is mainly played into slower metagames where it performs well, right? You don't want to be playing Yuriko against the rock size typically, but it actually hasn't really converted to much at all. Like, it's popular, it's seeing a lot of play, but it really isn't performing well. We kind of mentioned some of the issues Najeela has with getting in when everyone is a slow deck. Being like a slow, inevitable deck isn't really as much of a strength when a lot of other decks are doing it and they have access to more colors and higher card quality than you. Because right now, if you're at a table full of like 3 good stuff decks and you're the one synergy based deck that's running a 1/1 ninja that doesn't do anything, doesn't really look like that favors you when they're all trying to play a long game and your cards are straight up worse than all of theirs.
I was just taking a look at just for the fact that it's played so much, and I'm just like looking at like other decks that are supposedly dead or have died off that still like have better like conversion rates than this. When the bans happen, it allotted people who had their Tiger Shadow decks on the shelf that may not play as much competitive cEDH. It's like, all right, cool. Dockside's banned, Fast Mana's banned. I can hop in here and just like get the ball rolling. Because as we've talked about before, you've always suggested this as a friendly beginner deck for
Hmm.
people to roll into because the translation from casual to cEDH is there. And I just feel like that deck suffers a lot from the amount of popularity it has versus the actual results it can produce.
Yeah, it can kind of be. A lot of people will mention that with Kinnan too. Like the two, those are kind of the two decks that new people get pointed towards, where they're like, these are decks that have relatively straightforward plans. They do lean like reactive, which I think is harder for new people to get right. But in terms of like what their development looks like, it really appeals to a lot of more casual players. Yeah, it can be a hindrance when, especially like, if you're playing Doomsday Yuriko, like that's not an easy card for a new player to resolve at all. It's Doomsday. And then you're thinking about like, okay, what do I commandeer? Like you're a new player. You might be sitting there thinking, do I commandeer a Sylvan library or something, right? Like if you're actually new, yeah, that sounds funny to us, but like your threat assessment is the biggest thing that needs an update when you come to cEDH. Like what is actually the cards that win the game? And that's really hard to slot into what is actually a tempo kind of control deck when you don't know what's going on in the format. I think Yuriko is positioned kind of poorly. I don't know about, 12% conversion rate. It's probably, I think, assuming the people currently on it, like, get some time to develop with it, try to account for maybe some new player bias. Maybe it's closer to like 17%, like 18, like the Rock Thras numbers, maybe. I think Rock Thras is a little under what I expect it to be. But the really good pilots, it's probably not a bad deck, but I still don't think it's positioned super well at the moment for some of the reasons that I said. But like you mentioned, it probably is seeing an influx of people who are returning to the format or new to the format, and it is getting kind of ding some points.
Ultimately, I think the deck is going to suffer from the card quality aspect of it because it has to play some larger cards to I guess help close out the game. I wonder if there was a build of this deck that played more that just relied specifically on Mnemonic Betrayal, maybe Mnemonic Betrayal, Yawgmoth's Will, and like Praetor's Grasp, that those types of cards. And it just was like Dimir good stuff. And it just ran the best high quality creatures it can. And then obviously being a 2-color deck, you get things like Spectral Sailor or something like that. Maybe you got whatever few ninjas you really need. And you just build your deck to just be like the highest quality version of these
Yeah.
cards and don't focus so much on the doming somebody for whatever off that big card. Sure, Commandeer I think is a fine card
Mhm.
because you're getting to be 2 colors and you have a higher density of blue, but you don't have to run some of the less savory cards in your deck.
It's always seemed to me like you should run the big stuff that's free to run, like stuff that you would just run anyways. It should be bonus, and then but running things like you never expect to cast, or like Shadow of Mortality. I guess that's a relatively castable one, but like putting a 15 drop in there just to do it doesn't seem great. Yuriko is a really interesting deck that is super consistent to the point of kind of being monotonous with how it plays in the early game, where it's just like turn 1, evasive threat, turn 2, Yuriko, discard to hand size, probably like that game plan, and then becomes an RNG slot machine very quickly of just like, am I going to actually do any damage? Yuriko flip, island, Yuriko flip, snow covered island, and then just hope, and then like the Yuriko player always complaining because they hit they hit the 0s and 1s that their deck is still mostly comprised of and not the like 5-13 drops. So I definitely think just looking at it like Yuriko is a really good Tymna is probably a better way to go about it than running things that you're trying to deal damage off the flip. Just let them be, a value engine and put cards in there you actually want to draw. I think that very likely is probably what the better Yuriko shell to look like. Next up, we have another low color synergy focused deck, but this one performing a good bit better. That's with 71 entries, 15 top 16s for a 21.12% conversion rate. That is Magda Brazen Outlaw. Yes, it lost Dockside Extortionist, which was a kind of a 1-card win con with your commander a lot of times. It just meant you get a Magda activation on top of doing the Magda stuff. Obviously, it was very good, but that card did a lot of negative things for Magda. You fed Dockside like crazy, and you did not want to crack treasures to stop feeding Dockside. You run lots of kind of hateful artifacts or value ones, like all those vehicles sitting around. Those start feeding Dockside count really high. So I think overall, Magda gained a lot with the banning of Dockside. Getting turn 1 Magdas is a little bit harder now without Jewel Lotus and Mana Crypt, but they weren't like the biggest deal in that deck anyways. Because a lot of times you still just basically go land Dork by just playing a Dwarf and then turn to Magda. Like your low roll start is pretty decent. And you're still just kind of doing the Magda game plan, but you don't get punished by the Docksides. You don't have to worry about the game being faster. And the game being slower absolutely benefits Magda. Magda was never really a turn 2 deck. It's a consistent deck that gets to keep putting win cons on the stack and keep doing the thing. And it inherently sandbags its win attempts. That's what good Magda players are not activating Magda on the main phase unless they have a very good reason to do it. They're waiting till like the last second and then they're putting a win on the stack and they have a backup win on top of it.
I think Magda is going to benefit long term for it being monocolor because it just gets to look at every red card or colorless card that gets printed and go, okay, is this card like 8R deck? It just gets to basically benefit off of any decent dwarf that gets printed. You know, I think Magda's going to be really solid. And Magda's one of those decks that didn't get hurt by Orcish Bowmaster as hard as like some of these other decks did.
No, and
it
still in games can get absolutely bodied by Orcish Bowmasters. Like a Bowmaster start where Magda is like the best target and they have a bunch of little dinky dwarves. Those games will happen for sure. But you know, we've been playing in the Orcish Bowmasters meta. You should expect if you're in a top 16 as a Magda player, you probably are facing like maybe up to 15, but probably at least 12 decks that are running Orcish Bowmasters in your top 16, something like that. And they're still doing fine. They're still doing well, even with a card that can really blow them out. And it can be kind of the Kinnan effect of like, well, if you let me do Magda for a little bit, I have the mana to just replay it. Like I can just keep cast the things. Really where you can get them is the card disadvantage of somebody drew like 5 cards off Ristic Study and now I don't get to have a board. Like that's where they really can get buried. But overall, they have that super consistent game plan that doesn't look that threatening. You can't force of will a 1-mana dwarf that doesn't do anything, right? Like you can't really. I think Bowmasters just gives you a profitable way to interact with them that doesn't feel terrible. Is mainly what it does. Otherwise, you know, removing their dwarves 1-for-1 just never works out for you. So Magda overall consistently does really well, has some really dedicated pilots that didn't leave it. I think overall probably gained a little bit from the bans. They just lost a little bit of speed, but so did everybody else.
Yeah, another thing too about Magda that's quite interesting compared to Yuriko from the last one was we were talked about the card quality of Yuriko just running like, you know, like what was that shadow monster you talked
Shadow
about?
Mortality.
You're not really going to do anything with that card once you hit it off of your commander. Your card quality being low in your Magda list, the dwarves per se, just because they're not super impressive, they're like 1 and 2 drops. That's how your engine gets going. That's how you generate value. Seeing your lower card quality, but also being 1 and 2 mana, but also that's part of your commander strategy that you can actually still cast. It's a complete difference. And that's why it's really reflected in the numbers here of how well Magda's doing.
Like the whole deck just makes, man, it gets them towards the plan. I think that's the other thing with the difference with Yuriko is like you run kind of dinky cheap stuff that synergizes and it gets you towards something. But Magda is just like this, every little dwarf that gets to attack, guaranteed, that's 20% of what you need to win the game, basically. Every single one of those is getting you guaranteed towards that Magda activation, which has a lot of inevitability that Yuriko kind of has, but I think is way less actually built in and guaranteed.
And one of the most advantages that deck's going to have, and what we've seen recently over the last year or so printing, is every set has treasures in it. Anything that happens to generate treasures that's decent in red seemingly makes its way in here one way or another, like a Bottle Cap Blast, you know, that you look at that card and you're just like, you know, it's whatever. But in Magda, that card is like basically like kill a Bowmaster, make a bunch of treasures, untap win, you know, kind of thing.
And mono red interaction, we're getting a lot of like fork variants and like SWAT type of variants of like things that are changing target, stuff like that, where you really don't want to run it in like the 3-color red decks, especially once you get into blue. But like the double red cost in a mono red deck, that's fine. Like if it's actual interaction that's modal, good applications, all the modes are good, gonna come up for you. Like that kind of stuff really helps these mono red decks, especially ones that get to generate lots of mana. Like that has helped low color red decks. We're definitely getting more caught up in some of that space. What do we got up next?
We have at 111 entries, 26 top cuts. So we're seeing a massive jump in our cuts. At a 23.42% conversion rate, we have Sisay Weatherlight Captain.
That's like this is a different tier level jump. And we kind of talked about Sisay at the start and like what it lost, but what it also gained and how they're refocusing it. Sisay's already just were a really consistent toolbox. They've lost the ability to very easily develop like turn one Sisays. But a thing about Sisay is it didn't really do a lot for you on turn one or turn two. It was just a way to, if I have mana, I can, in the early turns, I can develop Sisay. And then as I go, I get something else to develop, that I might get my second pip for that, 3-drop legend that I get to play on turn two behind Sisay. But getting the game slowed down a bit, getting to really focus on what I like to think of as like the Tyvar package. The Tyvar has really made this all work together super well where I think without Tyvar, focusing on the Gigantas, the Fabro Elders, the Bloom Tenders will be way harder because like all the blink effects suddenly become way worse because Tyvar is such a good enabler for making those things go quick. And it's not exclusively Tyvar, but he's just the GOAT for those kind of decks. I love Tyvar. He just does everything that deck wants to do. And it's been the package of the Planeswalker stuff and the legends that we get access to, especially with all these new sets. We've gotten so much new stuff. And, in every set we've got Marvin, which has been really good. Eorith has been a great addition to the deck that was already seeing some play, but especially alongside like Marvin and Gigantha and the other Faber Elder type effects, you just have so much overlap to tap, untap, and get lots of activations. And you don't have to rush it out on like turn 2 or turn 3 with a Dockside Extortionist because the game is a little bit slower. You can expect to play into the long game. You can just do you activate Sisay on the end step, go get a decent legend. Activate Sisay on the end step. You don't have to be like fast tutoring for like, okay, go get to Fairy, cast Dockside, bounce Dockside, win the game. I've seen more of them start to play their own like Seedborn Muses and clone effects to get stuff like that. Sisay has just been able to adapt well. They don't have to do the Dockside plan. They have plenty of other ways to tap for Wooburg, make the mana, do the tutor chain thing, and they have a really great toolbox that they get to lean into that gets bigger every single set because legends continue to get printed at ridiculous rates.
I am going to be excited to see the first Spider-Man cards in this deck. There's got to be
there
a
will
good
be
Spider-Man
at least one. There's no way that set is going to have some crazy thing. It'll be something stupid. It'll be like J. Jonah Jameson. He'll be like like an Orzhov card or something, and he'll just be nuts. He'll just do something ridiculous.
Or Norman Osborn or something like that. One thing this deck picked up on, and Matt alluded to it, obviously, was it got Marvin. But another card that it got within the same set is Enduring Vitality. And I think Enduring Vitality is also going to be partnered with decks that play Cradle. So when you see the Cradle, you're going to see the Enduring Vitality. So Cradle really is the big winner. It's a pretty big winner post ban, and you get to see Sisay, which already ran Cradle, but getting another card within the green shell that just gets to enhance what the deck's already doing. And then it also play in, it's like, well, we need to make more mana. We have a bunch of legends in our deck. Well, what card makes our legends tap for mana outside of Relic? Azika. Now we have more of the same. So now they got a really solid, cohesive plan within that. So the ability to produce tons of mana that also isn't reliant on your opponents. So you don't have to worry about that Dockside anymore. So Sisay has a very, very strong community behind it. With those people behind that deck, I feel like that they're going to just keep on retooling and tooling it till they find out. And I feel like that deck sharpened up pretty quick post-ban to where we're at now.
Yeah, 100%.
I haven't looked through all the particular deck lists that are out there. Is pretty much Clam Chowder dead?
Yeah, I haven't really covered it. It hasn't popped up for me. I can't say like, oh, it's showing up in events, but it's not top 16ing. Like I just haven't looked that deep. Especially I'm not down in there looking at every Sisay build because like I already just point out the slight differences between Sisay builds. I don't want to do it any more than I have to. But I haven't seen any Clam Chowder. It doesn't, from what I heard, it felt like Clam Chowder pretty much died because they were the one that was really Dockside dependent. So you kind of have to lean into more of the Planeswalkers, I think, than they were doing. You could maybe get that hybrid like Planeswalker but good stuffy build, but it seems like overall it's mostly just Sisay, the traditional like Planeswalker Legends build, and I haven't really seen any of the dedicated Clam Chowder kind of just good stuff built yet.
The reason why I'm asking is just like the list that I'm looking at for the ones that have been topping. I feel like their card quality is a lot better because they don't have a billion Planeswalkers. It's just like, here's a small package of Planeswalkers. Here's all my good creatures that get me to my end goal. So what I wanted to highlight about Sisay being a very cohesive strategy versus Najeela, which is trying to be pulled in all these different directions. That's the the difference in the two, and they're both 3-mana commanders. One plays better to the battlefield than the other one, especially in this type of environment. So just wanted to highlight the strength of Sisay on that for the 5-color decks.
Yeah, and Sisay's flexibility is built into the command zone. I think that's a big part of it. Whereas Najeela's flexibility is I can play to Najeela, I can play to what's in the command zone, or I can just use like my black tutors or whatever to do this completely other unrelated plan. Pre and post Dockside now, Sisay has just done much better than Najeela has done in the time we've been doing this. Next up, at number 4, with 159 entries, so another pretty sizable jump, 30 top 16s, and an 18.86% conversion rate, we have Rogsai, Rograk, and Silas, the Grixis boys. A deck that we argued was the definitive deck of the pre-ban metagame. I think especially for the pace of play and looking at top level events like the Top Deck Invitational, things like that. That was sort of the defining deck. The format was built around Necro, really, for the first time ever. We were really more a Necro format than a Nas format, but Nas was there too. And then Born Upon a Wind, Valley Flood Caller, those type of effects, enabling Necropotence to be ridiculous. And then Dockside and Mana Crypt help you kind of clean it up, right? They help you get the mana to get into Necro, when you go like Land, Crypt, Cabal Writ, or you convert that Dockside into just like 2 or 3 treasures that helps you cast the Necro, or you get to do it post Necropotence. A lot of that stuff is weaker. Rog size mana development, similar to Rog Thras, got less of a hit than many other decks did. They get to run Mox Ruby basically with Mox Amber. They get things like Flare of Duplication, just one of the craziest free spells in our format. One of the only red spells worth casting. A lot of what they have is not weakened to the extent that other decks were, like their mana production. I actually think there's 2 things really making Rogsai weaker post-ban, and again, it's still performing pretty well. In terms of its drop, I think it is less about the cards that they lost and more about the fact that there are more decks that are trying to play uber responsible mid-range grinds and are really trying to beat up on Rogs. And if there's a few less Rog players because they might perceive there's a weakness of Turbo in the format, that they can kind of get bullied on more. Whereas, especially in the Invitational, we saw the more Rog size in a game, the higher the win rate of both Rog size ended up being. Because if you're going to jam and then you get beat, well, then I get the jam and then I get to start doing nonsense. And then you probably fed by Dockside too while you were doing that. And then also post Top Deck tournaments, a lot of the better Rogsai people, like people related to the Cabal or just people on Top Deck in general, aren't playing the format. Like that's been a big part of a lot of the really established players, not just with Rogsai, but in general, like, and especially notable Rogsai players. They're either not playing the format at all or they're playing much less and they're just less invested. And some of them have just straight up quit and sold out. So I do think you will expect to see a dip in the overall quality of Rogsai player because some of the absolute best ones you could point to no longer play it. And then on top of that, it seems like in terms of what is dictating the pace of play, overall, I think Rogsai's position is a little worse, even though their card quality arguably is higher and their mana production relative to the rest of the format is better than most decks.
Yeah, pretty interesting stuff because with the way the format has shifted, it's made other cards like, because now they don't necessarily have the guaranteed mana when in something like a Dockside. When they try to go for it, it's one of those things where it's harder to just push for that. Every deck can just potentially still have because it's a fast mana deck, it still has the Thassa's Oracle stuff. That inherently doesn't really change too much outside of Dockside. It's more so like post Necro, especially you get to see like, are they even still on Necro Dominance anymore?
I expect to see it on average still, but there are some people who are toying with not running it. I think I would still consider it a staple of the deck, but it definitely seems kind of more questionable now just because Necropotence itself is more questionable and like Rogsai is basically the Necro deck now, whereas like TNK was running it, things like that. And so Necrodom is, it kind of remains to be, I think the jury's still out on whether it stays, but right now I expect to see it when I look at a Rogsai.
Yeah, I'm looking at one of the lists that just top 16, the Vault. No Necrodom. They went up a land from the 23 to 24. And, you know, when it comes to like Rogsai, that's always like a big deal. One less Talisman. I see Chromatic Star still still in the deck. I guess it's just a good card to like fix your mana, and it's a great Beseech the Mirror sacrifice. What I'm seeing is a little bit more interaction. I see Into the Flood Maw. You know, I see Rain of Filth. That's really nice. That just kind of helps you push in the long game. But one of the cards that I feel like it hasn't really been talked about a lot, but for all these like ad nauseum decks that are Sans blue, and even some of the white decks still play, or sorry, Sans white, and even like the Mardu decks still play it, is Defense Grid is a lot worse,
Yeah.
like in this format. Very few decks can play Defense Grid early enough and still present a win, Rogside being one of those.
Mhm.
But once you get past that point of where you're able to kind of jam the win when everybody's getting set up, I was playing Defense Grid and Corvold is probably one of my favorite cards in the list. But it just, if the game goes past turn 3, which my deck doesn't present those kind of wins anymore without Dockside, and it's built structurally different in that way, it's just not as good.
Yep.
And especially with the, rise of Thrasios Tymna based strategies, which includes Seedborn Muse. And people are just holding up mana. We've already went over Tivit, those types
Yep.
of decks. If everyone's like holding up mana, and like you said, if it's everyone's holding their flash cards,
Mhm.
they're born upon the winds, they're otters, and whatever else that may be, that'd be something similar to that. That really makes a card like Defense Grid a lot worse.
Yeah.
And more risky to play to go for a win, especially if you're not as consistent with presenting that win, or if you're trying to storm through and people have mana to interact, they could just interact with you at the right moment. You have to pass the defense grid up to
Yep.
them. So it's not just the mana production. And that's something that I don't know if people have really thought about it, but other cards have this cascading effect where they're a lot worse. And then
Mhm.
obviously some cards got quite a bit better. But for Rogsai, because if you look at, like you said, if you look at the deck, the card quality is pretty high. Like it's still there. Like it's just got this super strong Grixis core. It's still on the 3 Final Fortune effects. I don't know if all 3 are still needed. Maybe it is. Maybe they're more important now than ever because they are trying to truly take advantage of the window of opportunity. Very much decreases as time progresses for this deck specifically.
Yeah, and I think overall it's been like the land count goes up. We saw like at the Boil, there were 2 rock size. They were both not typical. We've seen cards like you mentioned, like Rain of Filth. We've seen land counts go like up to 25 with things like Talon Gates even being like something we've seen. The One Ring is certainly more popular now because you are expecting the game to go like a turn longer. You have the ability to power it out very early. It does layer really well with like the Final Fortune effects of just like, if you can do a turn 1 ring, draw a card, turn 2, draw 2 cards, Final Fortune effect, draw 3 cards, and then win. That's a lot. And if you go any later than that, or you start introducing any like untappers like Manifold Key. We haven't really seen like Manamo, but the keys I think are worth experimenting with. We saw that a lot in the Japanese meta. You can do stuff with that. I think Defense Grid Pass is better now. So I will say that if you get to go, I'm going to do it like a turn 1 or whatever defense grid, the odds that somebody else wins on that turn have plummeted. So like you can defense grid pass to almost any other meta. The only thing, if it's another rock side or like a crick or something, like a really fast deck that just jams, I'm not going to defense grid pass. Otherwise, you see Tymna Thrasioses, those decks struggle to win on turn 5. I'm going to defense grid pass and I'm going to untap that. If that defense grid's still there, I'm just going to jam. But more than likely, they're just going to like waste the force of will on it and you're 2 for what somebody anyways, frick them. But like you mentioned, slamming defense grid in the mid to late game and expecting it to be Grand Abolisher, that's pretty much done with. You can, based on what the pod looks like, you can look and see if that's the case. But a lot of times, especially if there's a lot of engines in play, what might happen is you slam the defense grid, people are tapped out, you cast a couple spells, you trigger Ristic Study, which triggers Smothering Tithe, and you just turn mana on for somebody as you're going. There's just a lot of overlapping things that make that much worse than Grand Abolisher or Silence, and it's not really doing the thing. I think Vexing Bauble is like a much cleaner answer where like the threshold for mana they have to meet is probably a lot higher and the number of cards they can hit. Like, okay, Mindbreak Trap, if they don't have 4 mana, which is a much higher bar to clear, it's not going to happen. And the pips start being involved instead of just like, oh, I can use Mana Vault to cast Force of Will. It's a lot different. But overall, yeah, defense grid stocks are lower. I think Vexing Bauble you need to look at probably to overlap with that. Or if you're in green, obviously things like Dosen, City of Solitude. But defense grid right now, the stocks are lower. But if you're a defense grid pass player like I am, you could do some of that right now. That you do have that going for you. But whether that's what you want to do, that's up to you.
But people still jamming Rogsai. They're not giving up.
Oh no, I'm working on a build. I don't know. I don't expect it to become my favorite deck again because Rog Thrash just has so much cool stuff going on. But I'm working on a Rogsai build that I'm excited about. There's room to experiment with, I think. So there's lots of room for you to adjust to what you want to try to do and based on what you're seeing. And we might just see less of a guaranteed, like we were seeing like a 96 card core or something like that to Roxai until they like kind of changed it up for the Invitational where they were cutting the forces and stuff. And I've been hearing some people say they think just jamming and getting underneath some of these dorky kind of TNT decks might be the way to go about it. Whether that is like the actual best thing to do in the long run, though, is what we'll have to see. That's one that we kind of have to see if that plays out in the long term. That can be really anecdotal to like, hey, I spiked a tournament by just jamming a lot. Are you going to be able to do that across like 6 months in a year, though, is kind of what we'll need to see.
And are you going to do that with higher level competition?
Yeah.
Like as you progress in like, let's say a larger tournament and the higher rounds you go, I don't know if that strategy is I don't think it's going to be very favorable for you. Obviously we talked about the more ROG size, the better ROG size does, or just inherently more turbo decks.
Yeah. The more like pressure.
ROG size really take. Yeah, especially Sands, like any kind of like Sands Blue turbo deck, Rogside can take advantage of because they're not really going to be interacting with them. Also, I wonder, curious, the stigma for most players is when they see the ROG come down. You know, you're a ROG player and you're ROG Thrasios. People have this inherent like, oh, it's a ROG Rack deck. Here we go. It's that kind of thing. I've seen it a lot, and I don't know if you can jam as much as consistent either. You don't have Necrodom like this list here doesn't have Necrodominance. You're just down another card that allows you to do the jamming. Is Chromatic Star the end all to be all to this deck? I don't think so. The deck was very good without Chromatic Star ever being in it. I think I'd rather see like a Manifold Key in that slot. So now you basically add effectively a ritual with your artifact, especially your Grand Monolith, your Mana Vault, your Soul Ring's going to be like a +1. Obviously, that really helps.
Talisman.
Yeah, the Wishclaw Talisman tech is really nice. The One Ring, that's very nice. Potentially, I doubt this matters, but untapping a grinding station, but
untap Silas block
really
with him. Death touch blocker.
Yep.
Let's go. A thing I wanted to touch on that I think is easy to overlook is decks that mulligan more aggressively, like your rock sized and whatever. It's a lot of the Sands, like a lot of the Rakdos decks. They disproportionately would get to lead on things like Mana Crypt because they see more cards in the opener. Like you would start more games with Crypt, or if it was in your thing you did in your deck, Jeweled Lotus, because you just mulliganed inherently more than other decks. And so you kind of had this trade-off of I get higher card quality typically like on my 5 because I have to go there and my deck is just all gas. So like if I get the balance right, I'm good. But now you see way less of that. Obviously, you don't see any Mana Crypts in your opener anymore. So you don't have that land crypt wheel like that can kind of save a bad hand. Or land cryptistic. And then we've already kind of mentioned the post-Nas, post-Necro getting started is obviously a lot harder without Mana Crypt. Roxai got hit less for that, but every proactive deck that mulligans, like I tend to say that Roxai averages like out of 5, something like that for a good player. Like 5.5 is what you keep. The lack of one card is way more noticeable when you see 21 cards or 28 cards before the game starts. That adds up a lot more over time than decks that tended to keep like a safe 6 or something like that.
I've played against plenty of Roxai, and they would literally just mulligan to Oblivion to just get to like Crypt Wheel.
Yeah, or like
so
if I get to turn 1 Necro, nothing else matters really. Like it doesn't matter how many cards are in my hand. It's gonna cost me 3 life extra to who cares? I'm going to win turn 2.
Yeah, and just not having that ability really, that's where your limitations of the deck comes in, because that's also a cascading effect. Now you're not on as many wheels too. A lot of those they've cut the Wheel of Misfortune, which has always been kind of an in and out card, but the dedicated Rogside decks played Wheel of Misfortune. So we'll see. I don't know what Rogside could get in the long term that would like elevate it up again a little bit.
They don't really print rituals, or we did get Demonic Council, which I've heard most Rogside players say is they really like it. It is feeling to them like basically another Demonic Tutor. That deck especially, just it ends up with so much junk in the graveyard. Like you just churn through the deck. So that's been a gain. I was going to say we don't really get rituals and tutors, but we did just get another Demonic Tutor for the deck. So I can't say that really. And we got Beseech the Mirror last year.
But rituals, yes.
Rituals.
Wizards is not like printing.
We haven't got one since Culling Ritual. It's been a minute. They don't really do that too much.
All right, moving on. We have at 185 entries, 27 top cuts, and a 14.59 conversion rate. We have Kinnan Bonder Prodigy.
This is pretty much what I expected, which is
it's the most Kinnan stat of all Kinnan stats.
Which is be really, really popular and not be very good. That was kind of what I expected post-ban. I know a lot of people were super high on Kinnan and thought that without Dockside, that it would be just this huge gain for the deck, whatever. Maybe if you're a dedicated Kinnan pilot who, is one of the like top Kinnan players, you do feel that way. Like the meta has favored you. I mean, let me know if you think that. But overall, I did not expect a significant increase in Kinnan's conversion rate or win rate because other decks getting to play the longer game plan at a higher card quality and being less scary, kind of getting to be a little bit more taking advantage of like the political part of the game. Kinnan is just always in an awkward spot where one, we mentioned you have new players disproportionately play the deck, brings down the numbers. I get it. You are a mid-range deck that has to play a long game, but you have to mulligan like a turbo deck, and your commander can get Force of Willed, and it might not be the wrong play. Like, people will just try to bully you out of a game because you are fast and scary, but you are slow and grindy at the same time. So that is the real tension of the deck. At a lot of times, when you high roll with Kinnan, when you keep a good Kinnan 7 that lets you do everything, the deck feels amazing. The deck feels unbeatable. But that's the case with a lot of decks. It's a deck that hasn't really got too much in like the past year or so. I've seen some people mess with like Enduring Vitality. Like, again, that's a good card. Turning your Kinnan into a dork that taps for 2, kind of good. But overall, they haven't got a ton of new cards, not a ton of new options. And I do think that game plan, just when a lot of other people are doing it, when you aren't the only like Seedborn Muse wins me the game deck at the table, I feel like you just kind of lose a lot. We're seeing like different card choices come up. I know Dramatic Reversal has been a big one that a lot of Kinnan people are swearing by because it is kind of 2 mana activate Kinnan, or 2 mana just turn on tons of interaction. I don't know. I just still don't really see it with Kinnan overall being like a meta force again, just because docksides aren't there punishing them and people aren't winning on turn 2 as much, which I get was like they kind of preyed on Kinnan. Kinnan did struggle with like the rock size in the early games, but now their problems have just moved up along the curve basically to just how do I actually outgrind the decks that have true built-in card advantage that's super consistent and all the colors and tutors in the world to do whatever they want.
So I'm going to exclude the top tier Kinnan pilots that are out there, like the ones that can play Kinnan and
Yeah.
you just know that like if they're playing Kinnan, they're doing super
The
well.
like 2 or 3 best. Like, there's not really that many, but there's a couple.
Yeah, there's at least I think 3 off the top of my head, and that doesn't discredit anybody else who plays Kinnan and does really well with it.
Just imagine
But
you're
off
one of
top
the
my
3.
Yeah, yeah. I'll leave that to a mystery. I know 2 of them. I know everybody can guess probably 2 of them. Probably all 3 actually. But past that point, we just looked at that, and I get like it suffers from a lot of people picking it up and playing it. But doesn't every casual deck, that's an effect on all like decks that translate from casual to competitive, right? Like,
and I would argue affects every popular deck also.
Yeah. So every popular deck, especially like those like Kinnan, we see it with Yuriko quite a bit. But at what point do we stop?
They've had enough time to get good, I think is what you're trying to say, and I'll say it.
I hear this a lot, and this is one of those things that people say, like, oh, that deck's dead, and it's like, I'm like looking at the deck, it has like 19% conversion rate. I'm like, yeah, it's not very good, but it's also only played by like 6 people. At some point, I'm just kind of looking at these decks, and I'm like, hey, man, how many people picked up Kinnan? Was it 170?
It's kind of like I mentioned in the last video where people talked about bad players, and they like talked about how bad players enable certain things to be good or whatever. They can't be a disproportionate percentage when you talk about like this many players. You can't say, what are the bad players? Like what, 10%, 20%, whatever you would say, bottom 20%. They can't be dragging it down that much. And I will say like 14% conversion rate isn't abysmal. It's not the worst, literally, but it's pretty low. And you would think if this really is a meta game that favors Kinnan, surely it could, like a subset of players who are newer can't be dragging it down that much, because also newer players are much less likely to be very new when they bring it to a tournament. They're just less likely to play in tournaments in general. I think that's way more likely to impact your kind of casual play or your sub 60 tournaments. Remember, we're not looking at your 30-person locals when we're looking at these stats. These are purely the 60 plus events, which is a lot of the biggest events, more expensive events where you are expecting a lot of the people there had to travel for them. And this is not that likely to be the newest players.
Yeah. And you're going to have like higher quality like players also too. When you look at it, this isn't like 10 people entered with it and they just didn't happen to do well. The good players typically do better more often than not, but there's a ton of variance in cEDH as a macro across the board. But at some point, I'm just looking at these decks, like, obviously, we look at rock size at 18.86. We got Kinnan here at 14.59. It's funny how these decks, no matter what, we still like people will prop them up as like still like these, tour de forces and and cEDH. And we see other decks that have the same, if not higher, conversion rates and win percentages.
Yeah.
And people they dismiss them. And I'm just like, you had 185 chances to do better than this deck had 10 entries.
Yeah.
And you didn't. So again, if I had to pick like if I had to pick like 185 comedians playing Kinnan or 185 woundeds playing Kinnan, I'd say that number's quite a bit higher. I'd say it's like in the 70 percentile range. But I just think we need to get to have a little bit more honest conversation and take our feelings out of like, this deck or like, and we can't just point to the 1 to 3 people who do well with Kinnan when they pick it up. We have to look at it as a whole. And this goes for every deck, I'm not just picking on Kinnan, but it just really brings it home when you see that 14, percent conversion rate.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of different ways you can look at those kind of things and what you can take from it. That's another thing where like the data is never like going to give you the actual conclusion you can really take, like just on the face of it. Just looking at this conversion rate isn't going to tell us X thing about quality of Kinnan player or anything really, experience level or what the metagame is like. There's just all this other stuff. All we have to work with is a number. But yeah, like you mentioned, people do kind of give excuses to decks that they think are better than the numbers say, or they'll downplay decks where they think they're better. I mean, we had to hear about Rockside being secretly bad no matter what. Some podcasts will still tell you no matter what, it was always bad, even when it was the clear most dominant thing in the format. And that's, some people will just aren't willing to have a really honest conversation about things, and people have their biases about everything. There definitely is a point where you have to say like, okay, if it takes the best players of a given format to make this thing viable, is it actually any good at all? Like when you actually have to be a top whatever player, top 1%, 5%, whatever, to make it work, is it actually worth doing? I don't imagine it's that there are a crazy amount of Kinnan players who just refuse to learn from these better pilots and whatever. I think it's just, it seems like it is just the difference between those players. The players who are dedicated to playing cEDH tournaments every single weekend and who are there to compete, like if it takes them to do it, like that isn't the people who win every single tournament, right? All these other decks, they kind of can get piloted by other people. You think like it takes the best Tymna Kraum player to top 16 event? It doesn't. I promise you that. There's just so many of them. And the numbers just can't point to that really being the case. So whatever the actual, I guess, answer or like really thing you want to extrapolate from this is, I don't know. But it seems like Kinnan can't be positioned that well or can't be inherently that structurally solid and guaranteed to be good as a deck. I think maybe just less people should play Kinnan if they want to do well. But if you're having fun and you're doing the thing you want to do, keep playing it. Like, right? Not everybody is trying to win every tournament they enter. Based on what we've seen for over a year at this point, doesn't seem like it's the best thing to play unless you're like the best Kinnan player or you're aspiring to be one of the best Kinnan players and you're really willing to do the work with it. Doesn't seem like it's the deck to bring. All right, guys, now we get to talk about the opening of the format because we have a new deck that's in contention. We've got 219 entries, 52 top cuts with a 23.74% conversion rate. That is Tymna Thrasios, the biggest winner, arguably, of the bans, especially before. This was a deck that was, I think, had peaked around like honorable mention status. And
when Nadu was a part of the deck, it started ascending towards
it started to come
10.
up. And then, but at points, like especially when Atraxa was printed, I remember us looking at TNT and being like, wow, these numbers are terrible in the same colors. What is Atraxa giving this deck? And yeah, TNT, I expect, is getting more attention, and to some extent it probably didn't get that much better post-ban. It probably was already an okay deck. I don't think the bans could have made it that much more powerful, if that makes sense, to like really make it this jump. I think it got better both with bans and printing of new things like Hazel's Brewmaster, which just only existed very briefly before the bans happened, and then its game plan just lines up perfectly with what the post-ban meta has kind of shifted towards. Like if you're sitting there holding up mana to activate Thrasios, it it can also be you sitting there holding up mana to Born Upon a Wind or Valley Flood Caller or Emergent Zone. There is a bit of that. It is a very consistent deck. It has access to all the tutors you could want. The green tutors actually are a pretty good benefit to this deck specifically over something like Tymna Kraum, which if it had access to creature tutors wouldn't really line up that great. I don't think it might run a couple of the best ones, but here you have so much flexibility depending on what you're doing to go grab a Dork, to go grab Talents Effect, go grab a Wincon, go grab a Flash Enabler, go grab a Seedborn Muse. Like you just have so many different options up and down the mana curve, and you have 2 value engines in the command zone, which is also what we'll see at number 1 when we get there. And you got the 4-color good stuff deck of the format, but now there's 2 of them, and one of them is green.
Yeah. So one thing about Tymna Thrasios that we liked and we highlighted specifically pre-ban was the inclusion of Nadu. So the reason why is they gave that deck a completely different element. And then when post-ban happened, people were talking about Hulk's back and all the different variations of it.
Razakats.
Razakats and those types of things. But what we're seeing recently, at least with the recent Tymna Thrasios list, is that the core of the creatures are pretty relatively the same. And then we see a direction of whether we want to go like, there's some that I've seen that's on Hermit Druid and Tyvar. That package is basically just Hermit Druid, Tyvar, and Dread Return. And then the rest of the deck is your typical Tymna Thrasios list. And then we see another list that runs Tezzeret, as the ability to tutor up that artifact that it needs, specifically something like Basalt Monolith. And then obviously we have the Hazel's Brewmaster line, which has been probably the biggest upgrade for that deck. It's pretty wild though to get a ban of one of the most powerful engines the deck's had in a long time to just one of the best combos the deck's had in a long time. Like you talking about like, oh darn, they banned this card. Well, I guess we get Hazel's Brewmaster.
Yep. I was playing briefly in between where we had both, where I was doing Nadu Breakfast with Brewmaster in there, and it felt really good.
Yeah.
And I don't think at the time I had done Survival of the Fittest, but maybe I slotted it in. And like the deck felt really good. I just got kind of bored with it. I think part of it was Nadu enabled the deck to have an explosive potential that it didn't, that caught it up to what the format was doing before. Now instead they lost that explosive part, but everybody else lost their explosive thing you had to catch up to because they lost their Dockside Extortionist, which is like the biggest thing being in 4 colors, sans red, didn't get access to. You didn't have that explosiveness. You didn't have, even Atraxa to an extent had a technical kind of like explosive element of if you resolve Atraxa, that is an explosive thing you get to do, especially because you can kind of chain them together. And if you get food chain, you can just go infinite or at least get enough advantage to where you kind of get to expect to untap and just control everything for the rest of the game. It has been interesting, and there's been some development doing the survival, Brewmaster stuff has been cool to see. There doesn't seem to be a very wide variety of Tymna Thrasios decks that are actually doing well. Like it seems very solid set right now. The main thing you see is just a difference in the dorks. I haven't even covered one of those Hermit Druid lists. Haven't looked at one, but I mainly see just Brewmaster, good stuff. Maybe they're on Machine God's Effigy, maybe they're not. Most of them are on Swift Reconfiguration with Devoted Druid, because that one's really mana efficient. But for the most part, it is kind of a very solid core of like 90-ish cards, maybe a little bit more. That is just really doing the thing. They're grinding it out with green. A couple cards that we do see pop up every now and then is like Sowing Myca Spawn. Some people are getting more into the Cradle package and leaning more into that. That card can also get you an Emergent Zone. So like Crop Rotation and other variants of it like Myca Spawn are popping up. And like you can lean more into the Cradle plan if you want to kind of be like Rob Thras at home with more colors. That isn't like the de facto or like the default, but that is a thing that I've started to see like in multiple, in multiples.
Yeah, and even other like tech lands, like what is it, Alchemist's Refuge? That kind of I saw that land in a recent list, the top 16. That's a deck that people defaulted to back just because the format's less explosive. And again, we talked about this big winners, Cradle decks, and Dorks actually, I don't think I've seen as many Dorks being played in a long, long time, and it's nice to see. And I think another card too that I don't know if it gets highlighted enough, and it's just so unassuming, and that's Delighted Halfling. That card is very good, and especially to like if the game is about people holding up mana and they're going to counter something that's really really important. When you get to cast when you get to play like Delighted Halfling and cast a Cutzel that's uncounterable, it's pretty nice. That's pretty nice, and it just just guarantees your Tymnas and your Thrasioses to resolve and those types of things. And also the One Ring being uncounterable is not nothing.
Yeah, especially if you're one one of those kind of decks that's like running Manamo, or the One Ring is pretty scary, or if you know the game's going to kind of grind out and they have a pretty early, like a turn 2, the One Ring, like you don't really want to let them have that, when nobody's really pressuring the game, because proactive strategies aren't really at their best right now. You could be tempted, especially if you get an early commander, to just Fierce Guardianship that One Ring, not have to deal with it. But Delighted Halfling says no, no.
But you ready to move on?
Yes, we've changed the format, guys. There's a new king. It's different.
Well, we're here. All right, end of the year. Obviously, the meta's different because of the bannings. Even though we talked about pretty much most of the same decks that were in like 10 top 12.
Mm.
And that is going to be with 230 entries, 57 top cuts, and a 24.78 conversion rate. And that is going to be Tymna Kraum. Good old blue farm.
We've done it. We've saved cEDH. We talked about what Tymna Kraum was losing, and it definitely seemed like they were losing more than a lot of decks, because they were one of the better Jeweled Lotus decks. Being able to power out early Kraum was like a really definitive part of like the real dominance of this deck, was just being like Kraum as the main commander and being less of a Tymna deck. And just being like good stuff breach. That was their thing. Draw engines, breach. And, Tymna you would cast if you had the mana lying around, or if you got stuffed and whatever. But now we're just more in a format where Tymna is a reasonable draw engine again. Depending on how you build your deck, you might build more around it with cards like Delny. You see this in TNT as well. We're not really seeing a ton of things like Sarah Ascendant or Loyal Apprentice. A little bit here and there might pop up in. And then you are like cards like Professional Facebreaker, which came in and out. So there are more farmy kind of builds that come in. But the main thing that this deck, I think, has benefited from is being a high color pile deck that mostly benefited from sitting around to begin with. Like that was usually what Tymna Kraum did best. If the game goes long, they'll do some politicking, they'll draw some cards, they'll counter some spells, get people to feed them to help them to counter something, and then they'll untap and slam the Grand Abolisher and win the game. And they get to do that more reliably because they're not pressured as much in the early game by the rock size and things like that. And they are the deck that gets to do that with a lot of colors and doesn't have any synergistic tension, and they run Underworld Breach. That is the biggest thing that this deck has over Tymna Thrasios, is they can close out a game very succinctly, very easily, because one tutor just is guaranteed to, you get to resolve a DT for breach. You can, without anybody trying to stop you, you can win a game. That is a win con that only gets better the slower the game is, for the most part.
Yeah. And looking at several of the Tymna Kraum lists that have top 16, and typically I'm looking at the ones that are like doing like, second place, first place, fourth place, those types of things. So the higher cuts, a lot of them are still on Bergie. So they're really trying to keep that, a little bit of that explosivity in there. Also, something else that I've noticed, I'm seeing Rev pop up in them too. The new 4-drop that's basically like Professional Facebreaker Ragavan.
Yeah,
that's the best way I could describe it. It's also interesting because you would think that's like, oh, well, Grim Hireling's been a card. Why aren't they playing Grim Hireling? Grim Hireling's not a human. Rev is. It's also a 3/3, and it gives something you control death touch when you attack. But it being a human, it plays into the Cavern of Soul builds that are on Professional Facebreaker, Rev, and then obviously it's really used there to make your Grand Abolisher uncounterable and your Ranger Captain. So that's where it really takes advantage. And we talked about this off camera. It's just good deck building. It's just a small minor change that you see that really makes the deck look and flow a lot better and enhances your strategy that you're doing. So that's just something to keep in mind with these blue farm builds. And most of these are opting to not play opposition agent. They're actually opting for more of the aggressive slant in the face breakers and like cards like Rev.
Yeah, there's like a couple ways like we saw, and I got to cover like the Tremnick style builds in Europe. They're known for like their DRCs, their Jessica's Wills, Fergie's, of course, stuff like that, where they lean more into that sort of thing. Still being a red deck, and then we've also seen decks that choose to kind of be more Esper control-y, where we've seen like some Curse Totems, and they're like way less red centric now. They don't have Dockside. Kind of the stuff we mentioned with like mid-range Nas decks, where they can't just like, if they have a little mana left up, try to Nas into Dockside to win. Even in like the most proactive builds, you can't, I don't think, really expect to Nas, especially tap out Nas on your turn to win. But if you get to sit behind like Smothering Tithe for a turn, maybe you're at like 8 mana on your turn, you can probably still do it there. Stuff like DRC and especially Burgi can really help make that work. Getting that free extra mana on every ritual and every rock really helps. They're really the only dedicated high color pile. It's weird because Najeela was like a turbo deck and it's still awkwardly kind of turbo, kind of its own synergy combo thing. But like in terms of a good stuff pile that is a mid-range Nas deck, it's just Tymna Kraum. Really at this point, there's no synergy, whatever, nothing with your commanders. They are just two partners that say draw a card on them, and you are a Nas breach mid-range deck. There isn't that in other colors and lists really at all in this list. There's no, Kinrith attempting to be a Nas deck. There's no Clam Chowder Sisay. There's no Tivits running Nas. There haven't been for a little bit. Tymna Thras does not run ad nauseum. Basically, period, at all. It's just Tymna Kraum. And a lot of them don't run Necropotence anymore. That's become much less of a staple, and I think the decks that do are performing a little bit worse. So it is really a breach mid-range ad nauseum deck, and kind of the only one doing it. Of the decks we looked at here that run Nas, it's just Najeela, which is pretty bad at it, Roxai, which is a dedicated Nas deck, and then Tymna Kraum.
Yeah,
so,
by and large, that's pretty much it.
We've really moved out of Nas being a archetype defining card in a lot of ways. It's still there, still a relevant card. You resolve it, it's still good, but I think we're in a pretty different spot where we're not a Turbo Nas, Turbo Necro format. Another one of these quarters where Tymna Kraum is the deck.
It's been saying it for like since we've been doing this podcast. It's been like, oh yeah. Even when Tymna Kraum wasn't inherently the best deck by numbers, we just saw the trend continuously go up, and then I was like, yeah, it's about to just pretty much be there. And that's crazy too, because just thinking about like if you didn't look at the numbers or anything, you would think that just blue from conversations that you see on social media and stuff like that like TNT is just like it's the best deck by like a country mile, and Blue Farm edged it out, and more entries, which that's give or take, but you have more top cuts and a slightly higher conversion rate. It's crazy to show you the resiliency of that deck, and just shows you like now that you don't have to inherently turbo out your commanders, you just get to kind of like play them and set back and draw. And if you really think about it too, if the game is slower and the games aren't ending as fast as they typically were, that makes Kraum a lot more threatening as an air threat.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. The only point in this year where numbers wise a deck was like definitively kind of better was when that window when like Nadu came out and I think they were tied for top 16s, but had more top 4s and wins. And had way less entries. There's like a win, kind of like right after Nadu, like the first month and a half of Nadu, where it was like the deck. It very briefly, yeah. And then going into the Invitational, we talked about Roxai being kind of the definitive deck, even though TNK was more popular. But Roxai was kind of pushing the thing. And then now, thank God, the RC saved us. We're back. We're back to Tymna Kraum. And I think we kind of went in this first thing. And again, don't look at this as definitive for like this is set in stone what things are going to be like now. We definitely went from a top tier of 4 decks with Tymna Kraum, Sisay, Roxai, and Nadu, which is a very definitive, like these are the top 4 decks. That was the jump. It was like we look at the first 6, and then there's a big jump when we look at those 4. We went to like a top tier of 2 decks, I think, and they're both Tymna decks. They are Tymna Thras and Tymna Kraum. Pretty big drop off after that. Kinnan's the only one close in popularity, and it's not performing well. It's not good. So I think our top tier is just right now, if I made a tier list, maybe I'll mock one up. It would just be Tymna Kraum, Tymna Thras.
I think on our last episode, we talked about like, man, maybe just vanilla partner should be banned.
Yeah.
Like not partner with or like friends forever or all that type of stuff.
Looking at our top 10 decks and sorting them by conversion rate, we're going to go top to bottom. We have at number 1, Tivit, then Tymna Kraum, Tymna Thras, Sisay, Magda, Roxai, Thras, Kinnan, Najeela, and then last we've got Yuriko. Even clearly there, like Tivit was a good bit less popular than Tymna Thras and Tymna Kraum, but those decks still way over decks that were much less popular than them. So like lots of entries and still doing really, really well. Definitely points to them being just the thing to do right now, at least during this quarter. How people will, adapt to it, things like that. If maybe that people will look at that and try to address beating those mid-range piles. But as of right now, Tymna Kraum, Tymna Thras, it is hard to point you anywhere else. If you want to do something a bit more synergistic, more toolboxy, you can play Sisay, Magda, Maybe play Tivit if you're just basically want to do. I mean, really, the most pile-y decks are the top 3 conversion rate wise, because Tivit is definitely an Esper pile that has a single synergistic card in its deck, basically with Time Sieve, which just wins the game. And we are very pile-y based format right now. You want to do something cooler, you know, play Rock Thras, Rock Side, whatever. But right now, it is a mid-range, high-color pile metagame, and we are living. It's an Esper world, and we're just living in it. It looks like.
Yeah, Esper's pretty good.
So let us know down below what you think of this top 10. Where your thoughts are on the metagame and what you think is going to be popping up in the next quarter. You know, what you experimenting with? What are you going to break the meta with? What crazy card is going to get printed soon? Nobody really knows, but hopefully you've enjoyed this video and hopefully you like the cEDH meta. I like to see, you know, the top 3 be a little less what they are, and maybe we get a little bit more variety up in there, but I don't know. Maybe the next Nadu is just around the corner. You never know. But as always, thank you so much for watching and go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.